This is the Assyrian Eponym Canon, containing translations of the documents and an account of the evidence on the comparative chronology of the Assyrian and Jewish kingdoms from the death of Solomon to Nebuchadnezzar, by George Smith, 1840 to 1876. This was the guy who helped Henry Austin Layard and his associate Ramuzd when they unearthed the long buried Library of Nineveh, with all its clay tablets, 50,000 of them, which they shipped to the British Museum. He helped them to translate them into the nearest English. He has other books that he had written as well. Very clever man in his day. The Assyrian Eponym Canon by George Smith. Funded in public domain, public access, so no copyright infringement was intentional, and we bring it to all for educational purposes alone. The Assyrian Eponym Canon, containing translations of the documents and an account of the evidence on the comparative chronology of the Assyrian and Jewish kingdoms, from the death of Solomon to Nebuchadnezzar, by George Smith, of the Department of Oriental Antiquities, British Museum, author of History of Ashurbanipal, Assyrian Discoveries, and so forth. Published in 1875. Contents page. Preface. The Assyrian Eponym Canon will, the author at that time thought, require little preface or excuse. There is a general desire among all persons interested in biblical and Assyrian history to have in as complete a form as possible the translations of the Assyrian Eponym Canon and the accompanying historical dates and inscriptions. Having these monuments under his charge, the author wanted to satisfy this wish, so he prepared the present work, this particular book. He searched through the whole of the National Collection and picked out every date and circumstances likely to be of use in these chronological inquiries. The author, George Smith, translated these for the present work, and he collected in it an amount of evidence for the use of students not before available. The labour of these researchers can only be estimated by those who know something of the extent and condition of the text. The author has, or had in the course of its preparation, examined over 1,000 fragmentary Assyrian historical inscriptions, and he quotes in the body of the book more than 300 Assyrian documents. Others beside chronologists will be interested in the new text that he here has given, or these texts he has given, especially those of the time of Hadon, containing his war with Tirhakah and the association of his son Ashurbanipal on the throne of Assyria. Many chronologists will differ from his perspectives, his findings, as to his conclusions. They'll have their own perspective, understanding of it, comprehension of it. But he thought all would agree with him in his main purpose of setting together the Assyrian evidence to enable students to estimate the contemporary materials bearing on any question of the time of the Jewish kings. It would be understood that the numbers and letters before dates and extracts as K398 at the top of page 89 refer to the numbers of the objects in the British Museum collection and will enable them to be found in case of reference. He is only to add that in comparing so many dates, accidental cases of error in the numbers may escape him. But he tried to check this and hoped that the data would be found reliable throughout. The Assyrian Eponym Canon, Chapter 1, Former Literature and Systems of Chronology. The chronology of the period of the kings of Judah and Israel has formed a fruitful subject of discussion in all subsequent ages. Works have been written on this epoch from the time of the Greek kings of Egypt until now, and yet to that era, that year that he wrote and published this. And yet we are unable, after the lapse of 2,000 years, to settle the leading dates. The difficulties which stand in the way have led some to throw on one side entirely the chronological question. This result is unfortunate, because history cannot be satisfactory without chronology. The discovery of the cuneiform inscriptions, and particularly of the Assyrian Eponym Canon, altered the condition of the problem and introduced much new evidence on the one side, while it increased the difficulties on the other. The publication of numerous contemporary documents and official chronological works turned the discussion of the chronology of the kings of Judah and Israel into entirely new channels, and made a marked difference between the works published before and after the discovery of the Assyrian inscriptions. In the discussion of these matters, the author, George Smith, had sometimes joined after discovering new points of contact between the books of Kings and the Assyrian inscriptions, or additions to the Assyrian Eponym Canon, but his own opinions had completely altered or completely changed since he took up the study, and it was the first time he had ventured to give a complete system of chronology for this period. He still considered the chronology very doubtful in some places, and his views differed widely from those of the other chronologists who had taken up the subject. He therefore, wherever it was necessary, noted their conclusions along with the evidence for settling the questions. In tracing the more prominent chronological works written since the discovery of the Assyrian canon, preferences must be given to those of Sir Henry Rawlinson, the discoverer of this document. Sir Henry Rawlinson had not given any system of chronology, and with respect to the changes in Jewish dates rendered necessary by the discovery of the Assyrian canon, he had generally contented himself with the view that a reduction of about 40 years is required, or was required, for the date of the accession of Jehu, and he had occasionally suggested lower dates for other scripture events between the accession of Jehu and that of Manasseh. The remarks and views of Sir Henry Rawlinson were published in the Eponym, number 1805, May 31, 1862, number 1812, July 19, 1862, number 1869, August 22, 1863, number 2055, March 15, 1867, and number 2080, September 7, 1867. The Reverend Canon Rawlinson, who had taken part in the discussion, generally adopted the views of his brother, Dr. Hinkse, a distinguished Assyrian scholar and chronologist. Unfortunately died during the discussion of the canon, having contributed little to the matter except some critical remarks and doubts. Professor Oppert, who early took up the study, had given his final opinions in a paper communicated to the Review Archaeologique, whatever how you say that, called La Chronologie Biblique, Paris, 1868. No, it's French. The system of dates given by Professor Oppert at the conclusion of his paper is BC, and there's a whole list of them there. And it continues over to the next page. The main feature of Dr. Oppert's system is the view that there was a break in the Eponym Canon between BC 792 and 744, 47 years being here, according to him, omitted or left out. The assertion of this period of 47 years makes all his earlier Assyrian dates 46 years too high, and his later ones 1 year too low. Professor F. Lenormand, who had written on Assyrian history, generally followed the dates of Professor Oppert. The Reverend D.H. Haig, another Assyrian scholar, sums up a series of ingenious articles on the Assyrian canon and comparative chronology in the Zeitschrift für Ägyptische Sprache. It's obviously German. August 1871, with the following system of chronology embodying his views, and it's all listed here below. And it continues. Continues yet again. The Reverend D.H. Haig also suggested a break in the Assyrian canon of 19 years from BC 843 to BC 824. The great objection to his system lays in his denying the statement of Tiglath-Pileser that Hoshea began to reign in his time, or Hosea. Haig gives this inscription to Sargon and his assertion that Samaria was taken in the reign of Sennacherib. Following in the same direction, but to a far greater length, comes the system of Mr. J.W. Bosanquet, which is summed up in its most recent form in the Transactions of the Society of Biblical Archaeology, Volume 3, Part 1. The following tablet is abridged from this in other papers of Mr. Bosanquet. And it continues. The chronological system of Mr. Bosanquet is impossible, but Assyriologists are under great obligations to him for the noble manner in which he supported their labours. A little work published by Mr. S. Sharp called Chronology of the Bible had been the foundation of another school of chronology. This work deals only with biblical dates, and the accession of the Hebrew kings according to it are as listed below. Continued. Following in the steps of Mr. Sharp came Ernest de Bunsen, who published a work with the same title as that of Mr. Sharp, Chronology of the Bible. The dates of Ernest de Bunsen are slightly lower than Mr. Sharp's. He commences 4 years later, his date of Rehoboam and Jeroboam being 932 BC. But by the time of Jehu only differs 2 years, his date being BC 847. All his next dates are 2 years lower, down to Manasseh, who is given at BC 697, 1 year below Mr. Sharp, and at the accession of Hosea, the two coincide BC 641. Ernest de Bunsen is supported by Reverend A. H. Sayce, and his system accords in most places with the statements of the inscriptions, but it does not agree in respect to the reigns of Azariah of Judah and Menahem of Samaria, which according to the Assyrian records synchronized with the reign of Tiglath-Pileser. In Germany, the study of those chronological questions had been pursued with characteristic ardour, the way being led by Professor Lepsius, who published an excellent account of the Assyrian Canon called Über den chronologischen Werf der Assyrischen Eponymen, 1869. After this came an admirable work by Professor Schrader, and it's in German there. Not too sure what Keulen-Schriften is, but it looks like the something in the Old Testament. 1872, in which the bearings of the Assyrian inscriptions on all the passages of the Bible involved were excellently and critically discussed, and the best suggestions were given for correcting the chronology. It is true that in the main identification of Apul with Tiglath-Pileser, Schrader had been preceded by Sir Henry Rawlinson, but the German scholar added so much weight to this argument that it may fairly be called his own. It is to be regretted, or was to be regretted, that Professor Schrader had not given any comparative tables or exact chronological results. Germany had contributed another Assyrian chronologist in Professor H. Brandes, who in 1874 published his Abhandlungen zur Geschichte des Orients. Professor Brandes assumes that several of the kings of Judah and Israel reigned contemporaneously, and he thus compiles the following dates of the accessions of Jewish kings to compare with the Assyrian. And listed here, below, and here. Other writers joined in the discussion of these questions, but had not produced original or complete systems of chronology. George Smith's own former papers on the subject had only taken in parts of the chronology, and he reserved a full account of his own conclusions for the final chapter of the present work of this book. However, and he states here, that he first suggested some of his present views in a paper read before the Society of Biblical Archaeology and printed in Volume 2. In this short notice of the works of other scholars to whose labours he had alluded in this chapter, or he's alluding to in this chapter, he of course not been able to do justice to the arguments as proofs, and he confined himself as much as possible to a statement of their principal results, but it would be easily seen it will be easily seen that among so many different dates for the same events, more than one cannot possibly be right, and it is quite possible that all are wrong. Chapter 2. Assyrian calendar, methods of dating documents, institution and order of the Eponyms. In a country which has no settled calendar, anything like accurate chronology is impossible, and the possession of a regular system of registering and dating events necessarily implies some advance in civilization. One great value of the Assyrian records lays in the excellent system they adopted for registering events, and the perfection of their chronology. We are, through these aids, enabled to compare the Assyrian records critically with those of the surrounding nations, and thus they throw much light, not only on the events in which the Assyrians were actually in contact with their neighbours, but on other circumstances in which the indirect influence of Assyria is observed. Ever since the first discovery of the Assyrian inscriptions, a constant discussion had gone on as to the chronology of Western Asia, and particularly of the Hebrew kingdoms, and every circumstance known to have any bearing on the subject had been examined with care and attention. It was evident from the Assyrian inscriptions that there was a regular chronological computation in Babylonia, reaching up at least to the beginning of the 23rd century BC, and in Assyria to at least the 19th century BC. The period of the Assyrian Canon comprehended in the present work of this book does not ascend to anything like this antiquity, for there is no date in question with respect to it earlier than BC 1000, and if the Assyrians knew the dates of events more than 2000 years BC, we may safely trust them with reference to the comparatively modern period of the Hebrew kings. The first question in reference to the subject is as to the nature of the Assyrian calendar. The Assyrian year consisted of 12 lunar months, each month commencing on the evening when the new moon was first observed, or in case the moon was not observed, the new month started 30 days after the last month. Okay, so that sort of relates to the website There Was Last Chance, where they say there was 29 days in any month. The first was the new moon, and it wasn't a Sabbath. That was just basically its indication, or the indication of a new month. So if you couldn't see the crescent moon, or the moon, on the 29th of the month, well, there was an extra day. So you should see it the next night, right? It should be visible. The months were thus all either of 29 or 30 days, and these two numbers generally, but not always, alternated. In C1, Volume 3, page 51, 7 to 13, it reads, on the 27th day the moon was visible, on the 28th day, the 29th day, and 30th day observations for an eclipse we made, but it passed and an eclipse did not take place. The first day when the moon was seen, the day of the month Tammuz fixed. The Assyrian year commenced at the vernal equinox, and the new moon next before the equinox, marking the commencement of the new year, the equinox thus falling sometime during the first month, Nisan. In C1, Volume 3, page 51, are two reports giving the day when the equinox fell. One is, on the 6th day of Nisan, the day and night are equal, 6 Kaspu the day, 6 Kaspu the night. The other reads, on the 15th day of Nisan, the day and night are equal, 6 Kaspu the day, 6 Kaspu the night. 12 lunar months make about 354 days, or 11 days less than the year of 365 days. Therefore, in order to keep the year in its proper position in regard to the seasons, they adopted an occasional 13th month to be intercalated whenever the 12th month ended more than 30 days before the equinox. As the Assyrians had official astronomers who observed the heavens and regulated the calendar, they could not be far out in their calculations. Probably 1 or 2 days would be the limit of error. On the average, in the Assyrian calendar, the year would begin about 14 days before the vernal equinox, and the 15th day of the 10th month would thus be about the longest night. In accordance with this, on one fragment, George Smith found a list of the comparative length of the night in an average Assyrian year, and the longest night was fixed in it on the 15th day of the 10th month. Among the Assyrians, the first 28 days of every month were divided into 4 weeks of 7 days each, the 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28 days, respectively, being Sabbaths. Okay, so I'm going to go back there for a second. I'm going to refer back to the world's last chance and the acclaim of the Sabbath days every month being on the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th as incorrect according to this George Smith, right? Because here he's saying it's first 28 days of every month were divided into 4 weeks of 7 days each. The 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28 days, respectively, being Sabbaths. And there was a general prohibition of work on these days. So it looks like worst last chance is out. Okay? They're incorrect. Okay? The preparation days where you did no work, you made all your meals, all that sort of stuff, you know. Preparation day was when you did all your work, you talked all your political, all your gossip, whatever. You made your food for the next day, because the next day was Sabbath, you couldn't work on Sabbath, all that sort of stuff. So it would have been, these preparation days would have been like the 6th, hang on, have a look here. Okay, it would have been the 6th, the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th days of every month. Yeah, so someone needs to go to world's last chance and say, well, this, according to this archaeologist George Smith, proves that you're incorrect. You and your breakaways who say it's the 9th, the 16th, the 23rd, and the 30th. Besides the ordinary Vieta or intercalary 13th month, the Assyrians had 2 other intercalary months. One a second Nisan, the other a second Ulu. Well, okay, maybe not correct words last chance because they had 13 months. So if they eventually dropped it and had 12, well, that could be a change there, right? But still, they may want to know about that. Okay. We are members of that, so we might consider that. Okay, so besides the ordinary Vieta or intercalary 13th months, the Assyrians had 2 other intercalary months. One a second Nisan, the other a second Elul. When all 3 intercalary months were used, the year would have 15 months, and judging from the fact that an intercalation of 3 months is required in every 8 years, it appears probable that these 2 extra months were connected with a cycle of 8 years, 7 years in succession being normal. That is having 12 months each, while the 8th year has 15. Only in early Babylonian dated tablets had George Smith found any notice of this 15-month year, and it may be doubted if it was ever used in Assyria. Who would know better than a person from Syria, a native-born Aramaic speaker, translator, history buff, Mesopotamian history buff. They probably know this, so it'd be best to ask somebody like that. So Mr. Victor in Alexander out there, maybe you can help us out. If you can, please leave us a comment in the comment section below and explain to us as you are a native-born from Mesopotamia or Bet Naharain, Syria, right? Okay, the following is a table of the Assyrian calendar, including these intercalary months, and it's listed here. All the names of the months, Jewish months, that's the equivalent, approximate English months. Nisan is March, intercalary month, etc., etc. Here's Elul or Ululu, and the Assyrian months, Elul, Jewish months, August. Assyrian calendar continued. Among the Assyrians, the regnal years of the kings were not reckoned from the day of accession, but is that when they sat on the throne, but from the Assyrians' New Year's Day, either before or after the day of accession. There does not appear to have been any fixed rule as to which New Year's Day should be chosen, but from the number of known cases it appears to have been the general practice to count the regnal years from the New Year's Day next after the accession, and to call the period between the accession day and first New Year's Day the beginning of the reign, while the first year from the New Year's Day was called the first year, and the following ones were numbered successively from the. Nevertheless, in the dates of several Assyrian and Babylonian sovereigns, there are cases of the year of accession being considered as the first year, thus giving two reckonings for the reigns of the following monarchs. And they're listed. And there's more information there. In the ordinary rotation of the eponyms, the series was commenced by the king, and he was followed by the Tartan, who was commander-in-chief of the forces that represented the army. After the Tartan generally came the Niru Ikali, or chief of the palace, the great representatives of the state. He was followed by the Rab Betur, or head of the priesthood, who represented the national religion, while the Tukulu, a military officer in attendance on the king, came next. These four officers, together with the king, formed the principal eponyms and representatives of the government of the country, and they were followed by the governors of various chief towns, the head of these being the general governor or head of the prefects, etc. And it's all listed here. So far as the earlier titles are concerned, this order was in use at least as early as the 11th century BC, and probably much earlier. In the cylinder of Tiglath-Pileser I BC 1120, the eponym date is in the time of the Rab Betur, who is generally fourth in the list. The cylinder belongs to the 5th year of the monarch, and as the royal eponymy was usually the second year, this will agree exactly with the list of titles given above. It will stand thus as seen.